Is one of you admitting everyone on the waiting room?
Yes, I am.
Super.
So is Martin. Great.
Okay, Adriana, I'll share it. When I stop sharing, you can start.
Sure.
We have a few more participants who are joining.
Okay, I think that we are ready to go. Yes. So welcome everyone. My name is Adriana Allen. I think that I know most of you. I am the president of the Habitat International Coalition, and it's a real pleasure to be with everyone today. Before we start, let's go through the usual housekeeping messages. The most important one is to remember that we have interpretation in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. So if you get the word Japanese, actually that is Arabic. So please go to the globe at the bottom of your screen and choose the language in which you want to participate in this event. The second thing that we're going to ask is if you could please write your name and organization, and also perhaps the country where you are joining us from today. And also when we move into the plenary debate, it would be great also if you can just reiterate your name. If you have, again, any questions or comments while the panelists are speaking, please add them on the chat and we will gather all of them and go back to them in the time we have for plenary discussion. And remember to mute yourself when not speaking. So to start with, I'm just going to, I just want to say a few words about what got us together today. Back at the beginning of October and in anticipation of the COP26, HIC launched an international call for climate justice to be treated and enacted as a fundamental habitat-related human right. And this call lives in the shape of a manifesto and also for climate justice and the many voices that join our campaign over the month. The justification for the call for climate justice is simple. People and nature cannot just wait for more conferences or elusive and ambivalent negotiations. We are seeing too little and too late, as many countries still remain addicted to an interpretation of development that cannot be longer sustained. When it comes to effective climate change, social movements and organized civil society are clearly driving ahead the process while governments continue dragging their feet. So to kick off this very important discussion, we have a recorded message, a recorded opening message from the UN Special Rapporteur on the human right to adequate housing, Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal. While we get the video together, I think that we got it almost there, but it's just important to highlight that what Balakrishnan does in this opening is to highlight very eloquently the links between climate justice and housing justice, the compounded crisis we face, and the urgent need to work towards the decarbonization of the housing sector, to adapt measures to prevent mass displacement as a consequence of climate-related disasters and environmental conflicts, as well as to move towards resource and democratically controlled processes of adaptation and mitigation. We can start the video.
Dear participants, friends, I'm happy to speak to you virtually at this important event following COP26 on climate justice and the right to adequate housing, organized by the Habitat International Coalition. Climate change is a pressing issue for many fundamental rights, including the right to adequate housing, and is one of the major thematic priorities of mine as Special Rapporteur, as I reported earlier this year to the UN Human Rights Council, and will be the focus of my report to the UN General Assembly next fall in 2022. There is a momentum behind it. Just last month, the UN Human Rights Council created a new mechanism, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change, and recognized the right to environment as a human right. The recognition of the right to environment at the global level was long in coming. For decades, an overwhelming number of countries have recognized the right to a clean environment by amending the constitutions or through statutory recognition or judicial rulings. While it is good news that such a right is widely recognized now, the urgency of our current moment, when we are facing the ever-escalating consequences of the climate crisis, is such that it may well have come too late. Indeed, even in countries where legal recognition of the right to environment currently exists, the actual reality of protection of habitat rights lags far behind. Too many countries remain addicted to developmentalist visions, where environmental change and climate impacts are seen as simply the cost of doing business. Climate justice cannot be built on such insecure foundations. While it is too early to say if COP26 and similar global processes are adequate for moving us towards climate justice, it is also obvious that a historic opportunity was missed at COP26 for addressing root causes of climate change. There was no recognition of a right to environment or a human rights-based approach to tackling climate change at COP26, as legitimate demands from social movements outside the halls for climate justice fell on deaf ears. While countries are willing to recognize the right to environment of the UN, there is no willingness to recognize that right at COP26 where it mattered. The international community must speak with one voice on the right to environment and climate justice, and not convey different messages at different global forums. Let me now turn to the urgency of addressing the negative impact of climate change on housing, which is as wide-ranging as it is indisputable. As more people flee geographic areas affected by climate change, they not only lose their homes, but their right to housing at their receiving location becomes endangered due to overcrowding, insecurity, and fragility. Drought, floods, erratic rainfalls result in crop failures in different world regions, causing people to flee previously productive regions in search of work and sustenance. Many of these people end up in cities, adding to already existing social pressures, contributing to overcrowding and rising social housing costs. According to this year's global report on internal displacement, more than 98% of the 30.7 million new displacements of people in 2020 were the result of weather-related hazards, such as storms and floods. These were concentrated in East Asia and the Pacific and South Asia, with just 5 countries accounting for more than 60% of the new internal displacements due to disasters. According to one estimate, over 1 billion people may be displaced by 2050 due to environmental changes, conflict, and civil unrest. This massive tsunami of coming displacements must be planned for, mitigated, and dealt with in a humane way. Red lights are blinking, and we must plan and act. Climate change presents long-lasting impacts on the right to housing, but at the same time, the housing sector contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. The way we build housing is a cost, not just a consequence of climate change. According to the Housing 2030 study, buildings consume over 70% of the electrical power generated and 40% of primary energy, and are responsible for 40% of CO2 emissions from combustion in economically developed countries. Low and lower middle-income regions see rapid building material emissions increase from 22% globally in 2020 to 51% in 2060 due to a surge mainly in population and economic development. For example, India, the rest of South Asia, and Africa, excluding South Africa, will more than double their material-related emissions from 2020 to 2060. By comparison, the high-income group sees a slight decline in absolute terms and a sharp fall as a proportion of global emissions from 17% in 2020 to 12% in 2060. Building-related CO2 emissions are a matter of serious concern in emerging economies such as Brazil and South Africa, and pose a huge threat in rapidly urbanizing continents such as Africa. Land use policies encourage growth-intensive and wasteful development in too many emerging economies. There is therefore an urgent need to move towards a decarbonization of the housing stock, and together to implement climate change mitigation and adaptation policies in a human rights compliant manner. Friends, Since I took over as rapporteur, I have observed that in different corners of the world, the right to adequate housing is increasingly threatened by poor governance, corruption, mismanagement of climate and urban policies, and systemic discrimination against historically marginalized communities. Evictions, land grabbing, displacements, exposure to pandemics like COVID-19, and social conflicts are too often the result, which all affect marginalized communities much more disproportionately. Unfortunately, most mechanisms directed towards mitigating, coping, and adapting to climate change, which have been implemented thus far, reproduce existing inequalities. Those exposed to the worst impacts of climate change are often the most marginalized in terms of resources and access to decision making, and are often historically discriminated and the least equipped to manage the associated risks. Climate mitigation adaptation policies should protect rather than harm people living in precarious housing conditions, and should reduce the wastefulness implied in the fascination with ever-increasing standards of living. We are all affected. Our societies have been moving at a worldwide pace towards an unsustainable future. We need to hit the pause button and reevaluate the way we define our quality of life and the meaning of adequate standard of living, including under Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that we are aiming for. What is the meaning of ever-increasing standard of living in a world facing climate catastrophe? Is it okay to live in luxury when there is no clean air, safe drinking water, healthful food, and pristine nature left to share with everyone? What good are our homes if they cannot provide shelter against impending disasters that come with climate change, or if they make the planet more unlivable? We need to put our minds together and reimagine a world of carbon neutral housing that will sustain our present and future and lets us all live together in solidarity and peace. We need to develop new technologies that allow us to achieve this effectively, fairly, and expeditiously, and abandon our fascination with developmentalist visions committed to ever-expanding growth and unsustainable standards of living. I wish you the very best in this meeting for a productive and engaging discussion of the challenges ahead and towards working together to addressing them. Thank you.
Well, I think that we start with a great setting for the discussion and the tone to follow in this discussion. I think that clearly, I mean, the key point that Rajagopal highlights has to do with these massive asymmetries, geographical and historical asymmetries between the responsibles for this crisis and those that are affected the most, and at the same time face and count, have less control over actions on climate change. I'm going to share with you, if we can share the next slide, I'm going to share with you what's the plan in terms of the discussion that follows. So in the rest of the discussion, we are going to have 2 blocks. And as I said before, we will have plenty of time for debate, for plenary debate. And it's great to see so many of you still joining now. In the first block, we have Nessim Ashur and David Dortmund, who I believe is not yet with us, who are going to share with us some takeaways from the COP26 from a human rights and climate justice perspective. And then we will move into unpacking what the different pathways that we outlined in our manifesto towards climate justice mean in more detail, with the support of 4 wonderful speakers. So without further delay, I'm going to invite Nessim. Nessim, perhaps we can just say Nessim Ashur is project coordinator at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Brussels, and his work focuses on climate and energy and alternative socio-ecological models. He was present during events and mobilizations both inside and outside the COP summit, and will share with us some of his main takeaways and reflections from the perspective of mobilized groups working towards the building of a just transition. Nessim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adriana, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be with you today. And without further ado, I'm going to start my presentation. And I don't need to come back to the urgency under which this COP was happening and the climate catastrophe that we are currently living, but it's, I think, always important to remind everyone that it is happening now, and especially in the global south, and so many people are already affected. So just as a very short introduction about the work of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation at the COP, we come at the COP with a large delegation of around 30 people from all over the globe, and especially the global south, who participate in the climate summit in many ways as observers, delegates. Sorry?
Sorry, Nassim, sorry to interrupt you. Maybe if you could just speak a little bit louder, because your sound is failing a little bit.
Sorry, can you hear me better?
That is better. Nassim, louder and slower for the interpreters.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about this. Yeah, so this large delegation is like we are bringing a large delegation with a large array of expertise, knowledge, and experience, especially from the global south. And there, the exchange, the discussions that we get from the delegation as well offer, I think, a diverse and very interesting picture of what a COP means and represents from different perspectives. So I'm going to try to bring back this perspective and this analysis that we have from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, from the COP26. And I think this is an interesting, somehow one interesting perspective that we can bring is the fact that we are present both within the official summit of the COP, but also quite present in the what we call often the social summit, the counter summit. This year it was the COP26 coalition summit, with then two very different perspectives and assessments. But first of all, I think one of the picture that we took back was one of a very exclusionary COP, with a lot of police presence, but as well the vaccine inequalities that are still in place, and that brought so much difficulties from so many participants of the global south. On top of this, the visa difficulties as well really limited the participation of people from the global south, and the very expensive cost of accommodation in Glasgow was also a very big problem for many activists. So a very short assessment about the COP outcome, the official COP outcomes. I think that what we've seen, and not so much entering into the details, as I imagine it will be done later as well, but what we've seen is that from Article 6 to the net zero trap, as well as the unfit NDCs, we've seen the unwillingness of major powers and Western states to really act beyond what their political elites has defined as their geopolitical interests, often represented by the protection of their energy mix, as well as their and the corporation vested interest. If we have a look at the question of just transition, and the topic of just transitions that I've been following together with some other colleagues, at first sight there were some satisfaction from a part of some of the trade unions, that there were some mentions of the notion of just transition within the final text, with the wording of the need to ensure just transition toward a low carbon future and the creation of a decent work and quality job. And this is a positive advancement, but it's also sadly vague enough to kind of be abused for arguing for paying compensation to the industries and their financials for lost future income. But we can also really ask ourselves what just transitions means when we have seen during this COP that the 100 billion per year for climate finance that were one of the very important goals for that COP was not even met. And with around 70% of that, the climate finance that was pledged in the form of loans and investments instead of grants, raising the debt burdens of countries that are already of global South countries that are already supporting the brunt of climate destruction and that have suffered colonial processes. We can also ask what the just transitions means when the question of loss and damage, one of the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreements, was not even on the agenda for the official agenda for this COP, but got more attractions thanks to the work of civil society and civil society of the global South, especially. But at the end, did not really receive any resource and stayed at the level of technical assistance, which will also progress, but obviously not sufficient enough when we compare it to the current destructions and the coming ones. Or when the currently presented NDCs, so the nationally determined contributions, are bringing us towards 2.5 degrees, which means a catastrophic outcome, or that also carbon markets are set up to make sure that they will leave space for polluters to continue to doing so. So what does it mean for the workers and communities that are being and that will be impacted so much by climate change effects and impacts? We can have ourselves that that the just transition language makes it an empty shell used by corporate powers to greenwash their practices is a real one, and needs to there is the need for social movements to really make sure this is not happening. But I don't want to stay with this kind of very negative notes, and there was some progress, as it will be highlighted later, I guess. But I want to come back to the other side of the COP26 and the COP26 Coalition Summit, where we have had the presence of voices of frontline and indigenous communities together with radical social movements and groups on the global north that showed that the movement for climate justice has not vanished with the pandemic, like it was sometimes portrayed in the media. The quality of the discussions, the stories that were shared during those 2 days were really impressive and showed the degree of maturity of the movement. Really, something that needs to be underlined. And I think this was the importance of those outside gathering and summits was highlighted in one of the events that we organized as the Rosa Luxembourg Foundation together with other partners on the question of the necessity of a fair and transformative global Green New Deal, where we had activists and thinkers from all over the global South that could discuss with the people in the room, and mostly people from the UK, from Glasgow, and elsewhere as well. The needs for the call for a global transformative plan to be really anchored in the demand and struggle of the global South. It was also highlighted the new colonial aspect of plans like the European Green Deal right now, with its huge extractive impacts on countries in Latin America or in Southeast Asia as well. And it was also really echoed by many panelists there that why the sovereignty and specificity of every regions and countries were asking for those plans to be adaptive, and that no one size fits all could work, and that was really important to bring back. One last interesting point, and I think that's something that would interest also the audience today, is when the Rosa Luxembourg delegation had a really interesting and inspiring experience with the representative of the Scottish tenant unions called the Living Rent, that could explain to our audience, and mostly people again from participants from the Global South, the often very precarious and bad housing conditions in Scotland, and the work that they have been able to achieve with tenants in raising awareness, advocating at a national level on renovation and refurbishment, with climate justice advocacy goals as well, and already improving living conditions. And I think this really solidarity between part of the global North movements with climate justice groups on the Global South was also very present during the two marches that happened during the Glasgow summit, where on the Saturday there were more than 150,000 people in the streets of Glasgow, where workers, climate justice activists, housing activists as well as a lot of ordinary people were marching together in the streets of Glasgow. So that was a very powerful goal. And as I think that I'm coming to an end of my presentation, I think we've seen again the need for the climate justice movement to continue to bring those calls for justice, reparation, and fairness within the COP. But I think that COP shows also how important is it to continue to be organized outside of those spaces, to not only bring the voices but also strategize together. And I think that's something that the movement needs to reflect on, knowing that the next COP is planning to be in Egypt, where obviously the democratic conditions for having such gathering are far from being secured, and therefore asking the question of what spaces, new spaces, maybe also the climate justice movements need to come up with for continue to do this crucial pressure and work that is being done now. So yeah, I will finish on those words, and I'm happy to continue during the later discussion.
Thank you so much, Nassim, for helping us to be there, both in both sides of this, climate crisis in dispute. Clearly the future is in dispute, and the COP26 and the coalition summit clearly represented what are the main tenets of that dispute. I know that we are waiting still for David Dortmund, who is also going to join with his
Adriana.
Yeah, sorry.
He has just joined us.
Okay. I was otherwise, but we can come back to that. I was going to say that I can see several friends and colleagues who were also at both summits and at the coalition summit. So I just wanted to invite some of their views, but we can do that during the plenary. So welcome, David. We know you were picking up the children from school. Thanks for joining us. So for those of you who don't know David, David Dortmund is the director of the Human Settlements Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development. He's an expert on climate change, vulnerability and resilience in urban centers, and his work focuses on understanding the nature of urban risks and the way in which daily hazards, major disasters and climate change affect in particularly low-income urban residents. I'm pretty sure you know him and you know his work because he's a mandatory stop. David was on site in Glasgow and participated in several activities, especially related to climate adaptation, inequality, informality, and the impact of climate change on human settlements. David, you have about 8 minutes. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And thanks for inviting me. And apologies for coming in late. As Adriana said, the responsibilities of work and the responsibilities of parenting don't always align perfectly. What I thought I would talk a little bit about is the responses to climate change and their implications for housing justice. I'll focus more on the policy responses to climate change rather than the direct impacts of climate change. I think that we've reached a stage where in many ways these policy responses are just as significant for lives and for well-being as the direct impacts of climate change are. And these policy responses have direct impacts through regulations, through financing, through responses to reduce risk or reduce emissions. So direct impact, but also indirectly through what these mean for the market and for markets around the provision of services, markets around the provision of housing. And to my mind, and I guess this is significant coming out of the COP, there's a need to achieve what's actually a fairly complex balance. There is a climate emergency. We need to recognize that climate emergency and respond quickly and appropriately. But at the same time, urgency can often be used as a rationale to bypass just processes and just outcomes. So there's been perhaps one of the most influential papers in the IPCC discussions, which I'm also pretty involved in, by Siri Eriksson and Lisa Schipper and other colleagues, asks the question whether climate adaptation interventions are actually a help or a hindrance in reducing vulnerability. So recognizing there is this mass of activities with the climate adaptation label, but does this actually address vulnerability? And some of their arguments, I think, are particularly relevant here. I'll pick two of them. One of them is that there's often inadequate stakeholder participation in the design and implementation of adaptation actions. And secondly, that adaptation is often simply retrofitted into existing and already deficient development agendas. And so their response to this is to call for a shift in the terms of engagement between adaptation practitioners and the people who are involved in adaptation interventions. And I think this may be my sort of first link across to climate justice and housing, a need for a shift in the terms of engagement around climate change and housing to one that is more focused on the people who are affected and need to be responding to climate change. So briefly and specifically on mitigation, and then briefly and specifically on adaptation. So mitigation, they're reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And I think there's some fairly profound questions around justice, around how the costs and benefits of mitigation activities are distributed. The costs around recognizing the responsibility for historic and present day emissions, and the costs around what does it actually cost to reduce these emissions. And there's many ways that this is linked with the housing agenda, the carbon that's embedded in construction, and the emissions that are associated with living in houses. And I think that the mitigation agenda globally often doesn't take into account things like the significance of the size of dwelling as a driver of emissions. And we know that low-income groups will be using less energy and will be living in smaller units. Also, I think a lot of the emissions, the mitigation agenda focuses on low carbon technologies that are designed as complete housing units and are not at all supportive of incremental upgrading, and also therefore often not at all supportive of affordability of housing. Or things like energy, the way in which if we subsidize feed-in tariffs to the grid, of course, that then benefits the people who are able to invest in the necessary infrastructure and the space to do so. So a set of questions then around the mitigation agenda and how that links with housing and justice concerns. In the adaptation agenda, one of the straightforward observations that I think municipal governments and planners often make is of a need for more stringent building regulations with very little understanding of the drivers, which mean that people are unable to afford even meeting current building standards and building regulations, or the simplistic application of hazard maps, which are interpreted in a way that doesn't look at the complex dynamics, both of the geophysical dynamics, but also of the social dynamics around who is located in particular places. And I think one of the really interesting emerging areas of research and evidence on this is around what's being termed climate gentrification, where we find that, and the evidence so far is largely limited to places like Florida, but where we find traditionally low-income neighborhoods, which for some reason are safer from climate hazards, being taken over by wealthier groups who are moving from less exposed neighborhoods. So a new driver, I guess everyone here is familiar with the complexity of drivers of gentrification, but here we have a new driver, a new set of winners and losers around housing that's being shaped by climate change. So those are some of the problems, I suppose, around mitigation and adaptation and justice. At the same time, I think there's, just to wrap up in the next couple of minutes, some good potential for climate change responses to contribute to more just processes and outcomes in a housing agenda. So if we think about mitigation, one of the really significant drivers of emissions is the transport-related emissions. And from this, we can build an argument which is really quite strongly in favour of taking location more seriously in the provision of housing or access to housing for low-income groups. So in situ upgrading, keeping locations that are central and also affordable, which yields a whole range of benefits around a housing agenda, is also really good for a climate mitigation agenda. Or the potential for reducing costs around energy. We know that as a proportion of household income, low-income households pay substantially more for energy provision. Are there ways of putting in new lower carbon energy at lower cost, which can also reduce costs for low-income groups? Or around adaptation, what's the potential for adaptation actions to lead to more just outcomes? But I think negotiations over building standards and plot sizes around location and construction of housing that is resilient but also affordable. I think climate adaptation maybe opens a new space for these sorts of negotiations to take place. Or working with artisanal builders, the people who build homes for low-income groups, including low-income groups themselves, to understand how they can do this low-cost incremental construction in ways that's better suited to current and future climate risks. So maybe we can come back a little later onto some of the specific COP-related concerns, but I think those are my reflections about how emerging policy on mitigation and adaptation presents both threats, but also some really interesting opportunities to bring together a climate justice agenda.
Thank you so much, David, and we definitely have a lot to come back to. I just want to highlight, just to keep our mind on a couple of issues that I think are very important and we need to come back to during the plenary. And I think that in both cases we are really grateful to both of you for, on the one hand, dissecting in a very clear way, an uncompromised way, the discussions, the negotiations, but also highlighting where is that some of those new spaces where we need to focus attention, where we need to focus thinking and action lie. And I think that a lot of our discussion in the plenary could probably focus on that, because we do need that. We need to focus on, definitely on not only denouncing, but on nurturing what are those spaces. I also like very much, David, I think that this notion that we don't just need to focus on the impact of climate change, but on the intended and unintended impacts of climate policy is also an essential thing. And it's true, we see in many cases, I mean, not only process of climate gentrification, but I would add also the processes of evictions that increasingly and at mass are being driven, with the justification of protecting people against climate risk. So a long list of issues for us to discuss. I want to move to the second block because I want to keep as much time as possible again for the debate. So if we move, I don't know if we have a slide somewhere there, but as we move to the second block, let me just give you a bit of a sense of what is a rationale for this. So I mentioned before about Hicks' campaign on climate justice, and this campaign and the manifesto outlines these 5 principles that you see on the slide as key pathways in building climate justice: parity in political participation, mutual care, solidarity, and social responsibility, the emphasis on human rights, habitat, not war. So thinking about the condition of conflict and peacemaking, climate peacemaking, how do we prove climate-proof peacemaking? Also the recognition of differences and invisibilities, and the need for profound economic redistribution. We have a wonderful group of speakers to help us really unpack and get to the bottom of what is that each of these pathways means. So I'm going to first invite Sebastian Duig. And Sebastian is going to be talking about why to build parity of political participation, what it means and what it involves. Sebastian is a senior attorney for the Center for International Environmental Laws, Climate and Energy Program, and the campaign manager for the Center's Human Rights and Climate Change portfolio. His work focuses on promoting the integration of human rights and public participation in climate governance and in strengthening accountability for climate harms. Sebastian will talk about the importance of shared governance, something that was highlighted at the beginning from Nessim, for transformative climate strategies. And following the grim outcomes of the Glasgow negotiations, he will elaborate on why participation, why parity of political participation and co-development are crucial to climate justice. Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope that you can hear me well enough. And thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to speak today and for putting such a diverse panel with so many perspectives reflected today. I think it's very encouraging to see HIC, the Habitat International Coalition, really joining those struggles for greater climate justice and to bring a diversity of views on what climate justice actually means and bring the habitat and the housing rights dimension to this. And I must say, this reflects the fact that we see a very growing recognition that to tackle climate change in a just manner, we need to reclaim these governance spaces. We need to bring human rights agenda back. And if there is one thought I can share from the COP26, I will try to come back to the COP26 a few times in my presentation, but it is that a few years back, we will have the one side event on human rights and climate change. And now there's so many of them addressing different aspects and perspectives, not necessarily always as the main theme, but actually really bringing human rights and different rights, including obviously the right to housing, across different dimensions of this conversation. So it's a very strong progress. Unfortunately, we do not see states move forward as rapidly as civil society, obviously, in terms of recognizing those linkages. So issues related to, I'm going to speak about public participation and a right to public participation in the context of climate governance, and maybe how this links a little bit to the conversation today. As mentioned, it's one of the 5 key areas of work that have been highlighted in the manifesto.
Sebastian, sorry, just to say, I'm just getting a note from the interpreters. If you could speak a bit slower, just to make their job easier.
Sure, and apologies also for the French accent.
No, it's fine. It's for all of us. It's a message for all of us. Thank you.
I will do that. That's what happens when you're passionate about the topic. But so why public participation? I think this was already mentioned very well in previous interventions, but there's 2 dimensions to it. The first one is is recognizing the fact that, of course, climate change impacts rights, and we have this huge ambition gap. And actually, the work of the IPCC was referred to already previously. They have a beautiful sentence, acknowledgement, and I will just quote, that's the only quote I'm going to use here, but they state that civil society is to a great extent the only reliable motor for driving institutions to change at the pace required. So there is this acknowledgement that without civil society pressure, obviously governments are just not stepping up sufficiently to tackle the scale of the problem. And unfortunately, COP26 is another example of this. But also, we know that we need to bring and strengthen participation, but really participation from a right to participation perspective, in order to reclaim the space for different stakeholders and groups in society to really participate in shaping the decisions that are made. And then I think this refers a lot to what was discussed previously, the fact that it's not just climate change impacting rights, but also the way that climate policies do so, and the way that a lot of actors are actually very interested in using the climate urgency and the need for transformational action to push their own agenda. And we see the risk of co-optation of a process, of corporate capture of climate-related decision-making, in particular by actors that have their own very vested interest. We've seen private actors across the board pushing their own agendas, and including in particular the financialization of common goods through a climate urgency perspective. And on the other side of the conversation, we see governments who are embracing this move because they just are struggling to meet the scale of the challenge and would rather withdraw in a way from their responsibility and embrace multi-stakeholders, partnerships, and dialogues, where they bring around the table civil society, businesses, local governments, different actors with very little accountability, and particularly also just losing sight of the ground for dialogues between governments and stakeholders from an environmental democracy perspective, which is to give a voice to those who are actually impacted by decision making. And I think COP26, like many of the previous conferences, reflected the fact that to have a say in the decision making process, you needed to show that you could contribute to action, that you were relevant to action on the ground, but not that you were potentially affected. On the days when we suffered this most stringent exclusion away from the policymaking processes during the first days of the COP, levels of exclusion unprecedented over the past 10 years, you could see on the same days the airport in Glasgow and Edinburgh packed with private jets, bringing some fancy CEOs and other representing very different interests. So I think they really put visually the contrast between the exclusion of the voices of those representing civil society and indigenous peoples and the welcoming in the halls of those who are bringing corporate interests. If we think about what does it mean to strengthen public participation from a right-based perspective, that's really about addressing root causes of marginalization and taking corrective measures to ensure that those groups that have been marginalized, not just from the perspective of climate vulnerability, but also from political marginalization perspective, are really unable to participate. And it doesn't mean creating a level playing field where everyone can just come and enter and speak at the microphone, but really looking proactively for measures that actually address the fact that we are not equal in decision making and that groups have suffered forms of marginalization, and in particular that there are intersectional dimensions also that are at play. That means that certain groups of the population clearly are suffering multiple grounds of marginalization, making it impossible for them to actually participate effectively to decision making. An environmental democracy or right to participation perspective will mean also guaranteeing that we have access to information, obviously before engaging in decision making, but also that afterwards there are right-based remedies if public participation has not been provided or if the input has been completely ignored. For indigenous peoples, of course, this also means free, prior, and informed consent. And it also means promoting an environmental democracy perspective or parity in political participation also mean that we need measures by governments to actually prevent the undue economic influence and capture of decision-making related to climate change by corporate actors. And unfortunately, at the moment, what we see, whether it's at COP or at the national level, is often measures to proactively support economic actors' input into decision-making in a way that really further unbalances parity in political participation. There is the climate governance space, unfortunately, is also not immune to the trends that we are seeing of greater shrinking civil society space and more restriction on civil society organizing and participation, strategic litigation against public participation in some cases as well. There is a very interesting report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly and Association that describes how actually the shrinking civil society space applies also in the context of climate governance. And there we see, to come back to the point made previously, the challenge is that we have seen governments and corporate actors using the name of the Paris Agreement or the claim related to climate urgency to impose policies on groups that are marginalized and really keep on advancing their own interests, whether it is displacing informal settlers for the sake of strengthening the resilience of economic infrastructure, or many other policies, both on the mitigation side, but also on adaptation. It is not only about the failure to protect the rights of those impacted, but it is actually much broader than that. And often when we speak about conflicts between climate measures and human rights, the first example that come to mind tend to come from the rural sector or from ecosystems related tensions, whether it's in forest conservation or issues related to land grabbing, but the same type of threats are increasingly also materializing in the context of the urban and built environments. At COP26, we had a great example, unfortunately, of what happened when civil society is not in the room. There is one, I won't mention the exclusion of civil society that was already mentioned a lot by Nessim previously, both like prior to coming and how the COVID apartheid in a way has prevented people from coming to Glasgow in the first place, but also then even once you were in Glasgow, the challenges to access rooms. The consequence of that, just to give one example, one of the low-hanging fruits in terms of how to integrate human rights in the COP outcomes was supposed to be a reference to the need for the new Glasgow work program. It's a 10-year work program on public participation, access to information, climate education, the need for this to be human rights driven. I mean, this should be the lowest hanging fruit. Civil society, UN institutions have mobilized to ensure that this will be moving forward, driven by human rights-based approaches, because those three elements, public participation, access to information, climate education, they are recognized as human rights. There is no question of that. And every state, except for the United States, has recognized the right of every child to an education on their environment in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Because civil society was not in the room, one single delegate from Saudi Arabia could get rid of the entire reference. And the decision was adopted without any reference to human rights, which creates a fear for us that this kind of work will continue on a non-human rights-based approach. And what have we seen in the past? It's conversation related to public participation, where we have something that's more similar to participation washing. We have great examples of how one community has really been involved in decision-making of an infrastructure with no reflection on to what extent this is made systematically across the population and what kind of measures are there to really ensure that it is not just representative from the local communities, but really that pre-existing marginalization are addressed. And so this is the reason for us to clearly continue to push for a right to participation or parity in political participation in the context of climate action. And just when we speak about COP26, often we have a lot of frustrating examples to provide. So let me just conclude with 4 reasons of hope. A couple of them were already mentioned. The Human Rights Council recently recognized the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment with a majority that exceeded our expectations. So that's a positive signal. There'll be a new UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change appointed in March, and we hope that this person will be able to go beyond just producing a 20-page report highlighting the linkages, but really unpacking what do we mean in terms of just transition, what do we mean in terms of public participation in climate decision-making, really focusing its work, her or his work on these issues. But also to mention just two other recent developments. The Escazú agreement entered into force in Latin America. That's an agreement promoting right-based approach to environmental democracy. And in Europe, the Aarhus Convention recently established a rapid response mechanism for environmental defenders who are seeing their rights to participate in decision-making violated and are under an urgent threat. We also seen the first African country ratifying the Aarhus Convention on public participation in environmental decision-making. So there are some reasons to hope that the vision towards greater environmental decision-making can be further promoted, even if that's very complicated under the COPs and the UN climate agreements. I'll just stop here and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Again, lots on the table to feed the discussion. I take particularly, this notion and this very strong and clear message on, why we need to realize and remember that parity of political participation will not be granted. Parity of political participation has to be crafted, constructed, and reclaimed. And I think that this is something that you emphasize very clearly, even with concrete mechanisms, how public litigation mechanisms, how rapid response mechanisms, and so on can precisely be some of the cracks, through which real parity of political participation can be expanded. I also thought that it was really interesting and valuable to your notion of what happens when civil society is not in the room, in contrast with the importance of civil society being in the room. And this call for and this reminder that actually one of the ways in which civil society can be somehow at the decision-making table is much more connected with concrete actions and proposals on actions than actually, the issue of being recipients of impacts. Much more there for us to continue and return to the discussion. I can already see some comments on the chat. Thanks, Annelise, for that. So let's move to to another one. It's not the second one. The order really, there is no order of importance in the 5 principles that we raise in the Climate Justice Manifesto. But another one that we want to engage with now concerns the need for mutual care and solidarity, but also responsibility. And we think that this is very important to put them together because very often solidarity and the call for solidarity is used as a way to sideline co-responsibility. To take us, we're going to explore why mutual care, solidarity, and social responsibility matters through the hand of Kadi Camara. Kadi was one of the organizers of the Women's March for Climate Justice that took place in Senegal in October, ahead of COP26. She is speaking from Senegal. She is a journalist specialized in environmental issues and also the general manager of ECOBAD, an agency specialized in communication and consultancy on sustainable development. Kadi is also the president of Vacances Vertes, and environmental education project for sustainable development in Senegal that focuses and particularly works with young people and women. Kadi will share with us how women's movements have been pushing for the debate on climate justice, or if you wish, an important reframe of issues of mutual care, solidarity, and responsibility as part of climate change justice. Thank you, Kadi. The floor is yours.
Je vous remercie infiniment, Madame Adriana Allen. Je remercie également les organisateurs, notamment la Coalition internationale pour l'habitat, à travers aussi Madame Yolande Henler, qui m'a invité à participer à ce panel. Donc aujourd'hui, vous nous offrez tout simplement l'opportunité, moins d'1 mois après la COP26, d'analyser les résultats de la conférence de Glasgow, mais aussi et surtout de maintenir la pression et le plaidoyer pour la mise en œuvre et le suivi des décisions et recommandations. Donc, je vous en remercie infiniment et au nom aussi de toute l'association Vacances Vertes. Pour ma part, Aujourd'hui, il m'a été demandé d'introduire dans cette seconde partie le sous-thème soins mutuels, solidarité et responsabilité sociale. Partant du fait que l'environnement ne peut pas se défendre tout seul, les actions et moyens permettant de prendre les bonnes mesures au bon moment en s'enrichissant de la réciprocité fédèrent les différents acteurs, voire actrices de la société. Aujourd'hui, comme vous le savez, aucune société soucieuse de l'éthique ne peut faire abstraction de la stratégie environnementale et les moyens mis en œuvre pour atteindre ces objectifs. Elles doivent avoir justement les capacités de donner une information objective, c'est-à-dire les bonnes pratiques, mais aussi les mauvaises. Faisant aussi état des actions menées en faveur de la protection de l'environnement, cette démarche indépendante et régulière sert d'exemple et permet d'influer sur le cours des choses. Aujourd'hui, les questions environnementales et d'équité, selon moi, font de plus en plus partie des considérations liées au développement économique et une multitude accrue d'acteurs interpellent les organisations contraintes à se positionner sur leurs responsabilités sociales afin d'assurer leur résilience face à un environnement en constante évolution. Dans une perspective de co-construction, comme objet de débat de la responsabilité sociale qui contribue à la gouvernance et bien sûr qui renvoie à un produit temporairement stabilisé d'une négociation entre une organisation et la société mettant en jeu les identités, c'est-à-dire les valeurs et les problèmes sociétaux. Autrement dit, c'est à travers l'engagement d'une organisation avec ses parties prenantes et l'intervention d'acteurs de la société civile envers les pratiques d'une organisation que se détermine ce qui est responsable ou irresponsable, acceptable ou inacceptable. Si l'inaction, pour moi, persiste, je veux parler bien sûr des hotspots tels que les inondations, la montée des eaux, l'érosion côtière, les épidémies, comme on est en train de le vivre aujourd'hui avec la pandémie de la COVID-19, la disparition de nos ressources en eau et surtout la perte de la biodiversité qui vont être la norme dans le continent africain. Et moi, je peux vous assurer qu'en tant que femme de terrain, aujourd'hui, l'Afrique, à travers le Sénégal, est en train de subir tout simplement de plein fouet les effets de ces changements climatiques. Donc, pour faire face à la crise climatique, la mobilisation féminine est devenue une nécessité pour donner une valeur juridique au principe du développement durable acté lors du sommet de Rio 92. Il est devenu également obligatoire d'appuyer les femmes à anticiper les effets de la crise climatique de manière à pouvoir continuer de vivre d'une manière décemment, si je peux m'exprimer ainsi. La justice climatique est devenue aujourd'hui une nouvelle arme citoyenne et nous l'avons compris avec notre association Vacances Vertes. Donc, comme vous le voyez, comme vous le constatez, un peu partout dans le monde, de plus en plus d'associations, de personnes, d'ONG, de leaders d'opinion poursuivent des actions contre les États et les entreprises sous la houlette des femmes, contre les États et les entreprises sous la houlette des femmes, excusez-moi de la répétition parce que c'est important pour moi, elle est souvent pédagogique comme on dit, pour donner une nouvelle trajectoire à l'histoire de l'humanité. Et c'est ce qui justifie d'ailleurs, comme me demandait tout à l'heure Sophia Torres, la démarche des vacances vertes avec la campagne en 2020 dédiée exclusivement à la femme. C'est la campagne dénommée « Une femme, un arbre » dont l'objectif était de planter 100 000 arbres à Dakar pour participer un peu à ce qu'on appelle la restauration de nos écosystèmes, parce que cette année, d'ailleurs, pour rappel, lors de la journée internationale de l'environnement, les Nations Unies ont donné le mot d'ordre, c'est-à-dire restaurer nos écosystèmes pour pouvoir s'en sortir. En milieu urbain, donc, nous avons pu reboiser 100 000 arbres et 1 million d'arbres prévus annuellement partout au Sénégal avec la mise en place de forêts communales, avec des aménagements agroécologiques pour l'autonomisation des femmes à travers l'entrepreneuriat vert. Donc, nous, ce qu'on est en train de faire aujourd'hui sur le terrain, c'est de planter des arbres dans des périmètres maraîchers avec les femmes, des arbres fruitiers, pour permettre non seulement de régénérer les sols, les terres qui sont complètement dégradées, mais également de pouvoir les économiser économiquement, car il faut se dire qu'aujourd'hui, c'est un véritable problème, la dégradation des terres au Sénégal. Et il faut reconnaître que 70% des femmes s'activent économiquement dans le domaine de l'agriculture. C'est la raison pour laquelle, d'ailleurs, pour la première fois dans l'histoire du Sénégal, le samedi 23 octobre est une journée qui est restée gravée dans les mémoires grâce à la solidarité féminine, mais aussi aux soins mutuels du monde rural. Ces femmes sont venues tout simplement à Dakar marcher ce jour-là pour réclamer ce qu'on appelle la justice climatique. Comme je le disais tout à l'heure, donc nous, au Sénégal, aujourd'hui, quand j'ai fait le tour de presque toutes les régions du Sénégal, je me suis rendu compte qu'il ne fallait pas attendre jusqu'en 2030 pour vivre les effets de ces changements climatiques. Mais aujourd'hui, on les vit au jour, au quotidien, au jour le jour. Et c'est devenu un véritable fardeau pour ces femmes du monde rural. Et juste pour vous dire qu'aujourd'hui, si la souveraineté alimentaire est devenue une réalité en Afrique, où 70% s'activent économiquement dans le domaine de l'agriculture, au Sénégal, avec 80% des femmes du monde rural qui s'activent également dans ce domaine-là, c'est grâce au leadership féminin. Donc, il faut essayer de trouver des solutions sans délai, assez rapidement, pour pouvoir aider ces femmes qui ont tant besoin de cette ressource environnementale qu'est la terre et qui est menacée à plus d'un titre. Prenant par exemple le Sénégal, région par région, d'une manière géographique, la zone sud-est est exposée à ce qu'on appelle la salinisation des sols, due à quoi? À la montée des eaux, à l'érosion côtière. À l'est, c'est par la dégradation des terres avec l'exploitation minière, avec l'orpaillage, comme par exemple à Kédougou. C'est vraiment à des centaines de kilomètres de Dakar. Mais ces femmes se sont déplacées le 23 octobre dernier pour venir marcher avec nous et demander enfin ce qu'on appelle la justice climatique. À l'est aussi, on est confronté à cette dégradation des terres, comme au nord, par les mauvaises pratiques agricoles. Donc, l'objectif des vacances vertes aujourd'hui, avec mon association, c'est d'aller voir ces femmes-là, de leur parler, de leur expliquer qu'il y a des pratiques qu'il ne faut plus faire et qu'aujourd'hui, la solution, c'est vraiment de promouvoir ce qu'on appelle l'agroécologie et c'est ce qu'on est en train de faire avec ces femmes. C'est vrai que c'est très difficile parce qu'il y a souvent des facteurs bloquants. On dirait qu'on ne nous écoute pas, on dirait qu'on ne nous entend pas, que ce soit les pays pollueurs, que ce soit au niveau local. Mais aujourd'hui, l'objectif des vacances vertes, c'est vraiment de s'engager à côté de ces femmes pour leur démontrer qu'on est là et qu'on peut trouver ensemble des solutions. Il faut également qu'elles sachent qu'aujourd'hui, on peut leur donner la parole parce que donner la parole à ces dames, c'est pour moi donner la parole à des victimes invisibles et silencieuses du changement climatique. L'objectif justement de cette marche, c'était de faire entendre les voix et les préoccupations de ces femmes à la COP26. Rappeler également aux pays pollueurs le respect de leur engagement climatique conformément à l'accord de Paris sur le climat, mais aussi inviter sur le plan local les pays africains, particulièrement le Sénégal, à renforcer leur unité et leurs ambitions climatiques au-delà même de la COP26, mais aussi et surtout de respecter leurs engagements. Initialement prévu pour 100 femmes, vous vous rendez compte, cette marche a été un grand succès, car nous avons pu avoir la participation de 375 femmes et jeunes filles, citoyennes écologiques du monde rural, des régions et localités du Sénégal, fortement aujourd'hui touchées par les effets des changements climatiques. Et je peux vous confier une chose, elles étaient vraiment résolument engagées pour une justice climatique. Donc, avec l'association Vacances Vertes, nous n'allons pas arrêter ce beau chemin avec ces femmes qui en ont besoin, raison pour laquelle nous avons décidé aujourd'hui d'assurer le suivi avec 5 actions prioritaires que je vais vous citer, je vais résumer tout simplement. D'abord, avec le lancement de la pétition qui a été faite d'ailleurs le soir même de la marche et aujourd'hui qui a été signée par plus de 650 femmes. D'ailleurs, toutes les femmes qui étaient venues à la marche ont pu signer cette pétition. En deuxième position, deuxième axe, c'est la remise symbolique du mémorandum du plaidoyer au président de la République du Sénégal. C'est vrai qu'en 2019, lors de la campagne électorale, nous avions lancé l'association Vacances Vertes avec quelques membres de la société civile, le plaidoyer pour la prise en compte de l'environnement et de l'écologie dans les politiques publiques au Sénégal. Et aujourd'hui, le président qui a été élu, c'est le président Macky Sall, heureusement pour lui, mais notre plaidoyer n'a pas eu de suite. Là, on vient d'introduire une nouvelle demande d'audience justement pour aller le voir avec toutes ces femmes qui s'étaient mobilisées le 23 octobre dernier et lire notre mémorandum de plaidoyer devant lui. Mais jusqu'à présent aussi, ça fait partie des facteurs de blocage. Il faut qu'on le dise, il n'y a pas encore eu de suite. On espère que notre message sera entendu pour qu'enfin on essaye de trouver des solutions pour ces femmes qui en ont vraiment besoin. Et troisième action prioritaire pour assurer le suivi justement de cette marche, c'est l'organisation de missions de reconnaissance et de documentation. Donc, nous allons retourner sur les pas de ces femmes pour discuter avec elles davantage, non seulement leur parler des conclusions de la COP26, parce qu'elles ont quand même marché, elles avaient espoir que les choses allaient bouger. Malheureusement, vous connaissez mieux que moi les conclusions de cette COP26 qui a été tout simplement pour moi une déception. Donc, en quatrième action prioritaire, nous comptons également organiser des événements populaires et scientifiques, des forums et autres marches périodiques pour faire entendre la voix des femmes du monde rural qui en ont vraiment besoin. Et enfin, la mise en œuvre expérimentale du projet phare de l'association Vacances Vertes, qui est le projet Naforé. Naforé, c'est Nature pour l'autonomisation des femmes à travers les forêts communales. Au Sénégal, nous avons plus de 550 communes. Imaginez aujourd'hui, pour restaurer ce pays, pour restaurer l'écosystème de ce pays, qu'on puisse créer des forêts communales dans 557 communes. Autonomiser dans chaque commune à peu près 100 à 200 femmes. Imaginez ce que ça va donner. Aujourd'hui, notre objectif principal, c'est vraiment de mettre en œuvre ce projet pour apporter des réponses écologiques adaptées pour sauver notre environnement et appuyer l'autonomisation économique des femmes dans leur terroir. Et je vais juste parler un peu du budget global du projet, si vous me le permettez. Donc, le budget global du projet est de 458 000 €. Et en attendant des appuis et financements, nous avons démarré avec nos propres moyens, comme dans la région de Thiès, à 70 km de Dakar, où nous avons pu quand même planter plus de 150 arbres fruitiers et installer des panneaux, des pompes solaires à la place des pompes à moteur diesel, parce qu'on sait que c'est des pratiques qu'il faut bannir justement dans le domaine de l'agriculture au Sénégal et un peu partout en Afrique. Donc, à ce jour, pour faire un petit bilan des vacances vertes, nous avons pu planter 150 000 plants entre Dakar, Fatick et Kaolack en attendant d'aller dans les autres régions du Sénégal. Et comme pour tout projet, pour relever ce grand défi local, nous sommes confrontés à des facteurs bloquants, c'est-à-dire des moyens financiers. Et j'en profite d'ailleurs pour lancer un appel à toutes les organisations prêtes à venir soutenir ce grand projet pour les femmes du monde rural au Sénégal, le projet Naforé, qui a tout simplement pour objectif d'accroître la prise de conscience et de stimuler le dialogue sur le besoin d'un nouvel accord climatique qui inclut davantage l'intérêt des femmes, des enfants et des générations futures. Aujourd'hui, l'enjeu de la préservation de l'environnement, pour
Kadi?
moi, oui.
Sorry, I will ask you if you could, yes, bring it to the conclusion.
D'accord.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Je vais conclure. Donc, parce que ce que je dis me tient à cœur. En tant qu'activiste, j'ai envie de tout dire. Donc, je dirais tout simplement pour conclure, mon combat aujourd'hui, c'est d'encourager, de faciliter et d'amplifier la voix des femmes pour faire changer la situation. C'est toute la pertinence d'ailleurs de notre dernière initiative, la marche des femmes pour la justice climatique, organisée le 23 octobre dernier au Sénégal. Et je dirais tout simplement qu'il est temps aujourd'hui de réglementer cette justice climatique pour le bien des pays du Sud. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you so much, Kadi, and apologies for interrupting, but we will get back to you for sure. And I know that there are many groups in the room who work along very similar lines. I think that, I mean, again, just to remind ourselves, you put many important notions, ideas, and arguments on the table for discussion, but something that resonates with me is this notion that climate justice has become a new citizen's weapon. And I think that this is very important when we look at this to see how, in fact, this is new citizen's weapon is very much being nurtured by the convergence of these different social movements and feminist movements, ecofeminist movements, social, economic solidarity movement, housing movements, and so on are clearly converging behind climate justice. A second thing that I thought that was very important as well is the reminder of the importance to think about how to restore the social but also the ecological function of human settlements across urban and rural areas. Again, an issue that we need to come back to. Many thanks, and definitely we will get back to you. We're now going to move to another key pathway or principle highlighted in the manifesto, which has to do with the idea that climate justice requires both conflict-sensitive climate change policies and also climate-proof peace building. To talk about this and tell us a bit more, unpack what these notions mean, we have Joseph Shekla. Most of you know him very well. Joseph is joining us today from Cairo. He's a lawyer and long-term advocate of human rights related to habitat. He is also the coordinator of the Housing and Land Rights Network, HLRN, associated with HIC, and he has decades of experience in capacity building, documentation, monitoring, and evaluation of state commitments and obligations to respect land and housing rights. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Adriana, and thank you to all these great colleagues where everyone is really doing his or her part to advance climate justice. It's really encouraging to see. For us, in envisioning a global human rights habitat without war calls us to recognize how the absence of the preventive and the remedial application of states' human rights obligations often accompanies situations of conflict, occupation, and war, but also how these situations devastate the environment locally and beyond. From a HIC perspective, deep changes in the coalition really moved the HIC board to resolve in 1988 to engage in major cases of housing and land rights deprivation, such as the treatment of the Roma in Europe and indigenous peoples everywhere, as well as apartheid in Southern Africa. This resolution also included reaching out to people under occupation, including the indigenous East Timorese at the time, Namibians, Palestinians, Tibetans, and the people of Western Sahara. That principle and many of these priorities really persist today. But these cases are not also an exclusive list. Shortly after that decision of HIC in yet decades ago, the coalition became one of the most influential in the 1992 Environment and Development Conference at Rio, and saw the establishment of HIC's Habitat and Sustainable Environment Network, with thanks to our late colleague from Senegal, Malick Gueye. The displacement and dispossession under war and occupation have been well documented, as have been environmental remnants in cases of landmines in Western Sahara, toxic dumping in Palestine and Puerto Rico, or depleted uranium and its environmental and health consequences in Iraq. The 70-year Chinese occupation and colonization of Tibet have transformed that land in favor of Han settlers and forcibly settled nomadic Tibetans in grasslands transformed for urbanization, and have curtailed their economic lifestyle and guardianship of that land. This has culminated in some 500,000 Tibetan pastoralists transferred into forced industrial labor camps, as reported last year, similar to the treatment of the Uyghurs in East Turkestan. Both regions have been occupied since 1950 by the world's largest current greenhouse gas emitter, and targeted for industrial agriculture and mining, damming, and deforestation. Tibet, the Earth's third pole, as people often say, is the source of water for billions in Asia and is in climatic crisis. I'd like to share my screen just now. I hope you can see this. This is just an impression, an image of what is happening in the north of Iraq, where the Turkish military has denuded the hills of northern Kurdistan in order to ensure greater monitoring and surveillance, but have actually removed vast areas of forest and vegetation. In another case, the Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara has long been the locus of illegal exploitation by external parties, including the Kingdom of Morocco's state mining companies. These include, of course, Siemens, foreign companies like Siemens, who are using the territory for, sorry, this doesn't seem to want to move. Okay, yes. They're using the territory for solar energy export projects to benefit distant parties in Morocco and Europe. Not only is this exploitation of occupied territory a crime under international law, but environmental scientists are also now understanding the potential harm that these installations cause to the local environment, including raising local temperatures and devastating local ecosystems in the name of well-funded green transition. The world is, and here's an image of Sahrawis demonstrating against the investments of Siemens in their occupied territory. The world is full of contradictions, and the Palestine question reveals one of the greatest environmental hoaxes of the past century. The Jewish National Fund, or JNF, with its apartheid charter, has nonetheless built an illicit reputation as a charitable and environmental NGO. making a former Palestinian desert bloom. Linked to the state of Israel under the Zionist covenant legislation of the 1950s, the JNF is no non-governmental entity, but still is allowed to register as a tax-exempt charity in some 50 countries. Its infamous forestation in Israel has succeeded to carpet the sites of Zionist massacres and ethnic cleansing of Palestinian villages with forests to conceal these crimes. Here's an example of one very interesting case of the massacre of the Ain Zaytun village in 1948 that has now been transformed into the Coretta Scott King Forest. This rather cynical twist is offering those people who are following the anti-racism legacy of the King family to plant a tree in Israel and actually contribute to the concealment of a massacre that took place 70 years ago. Another one, of course, is the case of Mughar al-Khatan, and this village was depopulated at the same time, and it now is the site of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Forest. The putative environmental viability of these forests is now in doubt. This is another irony. While even the Israeli Society for the Protection of Nature has excoriated the practice of destroying natural ecosystems to create unviable Bavaria-like landscapes to replace native environments. These now absorb more solar energy, replace local species along with the indigenous people, and remain susceptible to drought, as learned in the case of 2010, when in that drought, 80% of the artificially introduced coniferous forests in the southern part of Palestine died, and new ones needing irrigation cannot be sustained. These developments have shown that these forestation schemes risk to release even more carbon into the atmosphere while covering up colonial crimes in the short term. There's another very interesting contradiction that we should notice, and that became clear in August of this year with the forest fires around Jerusalem. That revealed also the underlining ancient Arab terrace agriculture underneath that belied the colonial image and narrative of a wilderness that preceded the colonists. These were viable Palestinian cultivations before Israel carried out the ethnic cleansing around Jerusalem since 1948, and that still continues. As we now know, the greening of historic Palestine by Israeli colonists is also used as a further bludgeon to persecute the Palestinian people. By Israeli regulation, the planting of any coniferous tree on a plot of land qualifies it as a forest reserve. That administrative sleight of hand forecloses that land from building or cultivation by the indigenous Palestinian people, including titled owners. The JNF is using that premise now to dispossess villages in the arid southern Nakab region by artificially planting otherwise innocent pine trees. And the forestation in Israel and a seemingly innocuous act of planting a tree is integral to the serious international crimes of pillage and population transfer. I just want to show you another example of a study by one of HIC's members, Al-Haq Law on the Service of Man. This publication, which came out earlier this month, deals with the occupation and the depletion of the Dead Sea. You can see from these images how that's taking place, unfortunately, as we speak. But this revelation about the hazards of JNF forests has thrown new light on the whole matter of green walls. The colonial practice of recreating new Bavarias has come to the Sahel also. The proposed Great Green Wall from Senegal to Djibouti is now under discussion in the context of the Convention on Biodiversity, where the JNF also participates now as an observer organization and promoter of this project. Although its application for consultative status with ECOSOC has been rejected since 2007 for two principal reasons. That organization is not an NGO, and it operates inconsistent principles of the UN Charter. But this other larger question of using the JNF's forestation example for a cross-Sahel green wall is its practicability, its fundability, its viability, sustainability, and hence climate change mitigation value of such schemes remain very much in doubt, especially in light of the revelations of the long-term consequences of the Israeli JNF.
Sorry. Yes, we just want to still have some time for discussion.
Okay.
We are a bit
I'm just closing, but all of these examples involve various forms of population transfer crimes under conflict, occupation, and war, including dispossession and displacement. Forced population movement has remained a practice of war since the Neo-Assyrian period, although these practices and their accompanying environmental harm have been prohibited under international law more recently, but human civilization has not moved beyond that despicable practice. In fact, housing and land rights violations, including displacement in conflicts since COVID, are also a special subject of HLRN's recent publication, which I'll link to you on the chat, Conflict, Occupation, and War. And the perpetrators of conflict, occupation, and war have been shown by negative example how not to progress on this planet and how not to achieve climate justice in any sense of that term. So I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe, and apologies for having to call upon time. It's not an easy job. I would rather spend the whole, a much longer period listening to you, like Adi and the others. We were to have someone else, Sharon Bene. Sharon is a Cree woman and lawyer who was going to join us from a shale oil extraction area in Alberta, and she couldn't unfortunately make it at the last minute, but I'm really glad to see that show us help also to bring to the fore a key dimension, which has to do with also the perspectives from Indigenous peoples, which is what Sharon was going to bring to the floor. I'm going to skip any reflections because I know that there are many points on the table. I'm sure that you, again, on the chat, and I'm sure that there are many points in the room that you want to discuss. So I'm going to move to our last speaker, to talk about profound economic redistribution. We have the pleasure of having with us Sandra Guzman Luna. Sandra is a manager at the Climate Policy Initiative at London office, and her areas of expertise are climate finance, the elaboration of national strategies on climate finance, and mainstreaming climate change into public finance systems. She has worked everywhere. I will just mention a few. She has over 16 years of experience in climate policy and finance and has been working as a consultant for the Standing Committee on Climate Finance at the UNFCCC. Sandra is also the founder of the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean and former General Director of Climate Change Policies at the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources of Mexico. Sandra will speak in Spanish, and she will be sharing some of the climate finance debate that emerged throughout the COP26, but particularly from the perspective of the sort of finances that needs to go towards a community to fund and support grassroots community initiatives. Sandra, the floor is yours. So to the interpreters, now we're switching into Spanish. Gracias, Sandra.
Muchísimas gracias, Adriana. Muchísimas gracias a todas y todos. Es un verdadero placer estar aquí con ustedes discutiendo estos temas tan importantes como es el respeto a los derechos humanos y que esto se vuelva un eje primordial de la acción y sobre todo la manera en que vamos a hacer de la justicia climática un eje guía de todas las acciones que hacemos en nuestra vida cotidiana. Desde mi punto de vista, no hay un tema que debería estar tan empapado o que debería estar tan empapado de la perspectiva de la justicia climática como es el del financiamiento. Y yo quisiera hacer esta intervención conectando los puntos que resultaron de la COP y cómo esto impacta o cómo esto afecta al proceso de la justicia climática. ¿Por qué es tan importante hablar de financiamiento cuando hablamos de la justicia climática? Porque la manera en que se han hecho las asignaciones de financiamiento, las inversiones, la llamada distribución de la riqueza, es precisamente lo que ha acrecentado las grandes brechas que existen, no solo entre países ricos y pobres, sino también dentro de los países, las grandes disparidades que hay entre la población. Hoy vemos países que siguen recibiendo mucho financiamiento, pero este financiamiento se sigue alojando en ciertos extractos de la población y no termina de bajar en donde están las grandes necesidades. Entonces, permítanme enfatizar 5 puntos, resultados de la COP y qué implica, cómo se traduce esto en los procesos relacionados con la justicia climática. El primero de ellos, como todas y todos ustedes saben, existe una responsabilidad histórica por parte de los países desarrollados para transferir financiamiento a los países en desarrollo y apoyarles en la implementación de las medidas de mitigación y adaptación al cambio climático. Esta responsabilidad histórica deriva de que son los países desarrollados quienes a lo largo de todos estos años han generado estas transformaciones en el sistema productivo, que ha generado esta exacerbación, este aumento de las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero, creando grandes impactos en la población y en países que pues no tienen las responsabilidades. Por ejemplo, hay muchos países que no son contribuyentes, digamos, grandes contribuyentes en cuanto a emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero y sin embargo son los mayores impactados debido, digamos, a las capacidades limitadas, institucionales y financieras de atender grandes impactos asociados a cambio climático. En este sentido, uno de los temas más importantes que se tenía que acordar en esta COP estaba justamente asociado a lo que llamamos el financiamiento de largo plazo. Esto quiere decir esa movilización de financiamiento que nos va a permitir atender las necesidades asociadas a cambio climático. Recordemos que en 2009 se hizo un compromiso por parte de los países desarrollados de transferir $100,000 millones a los países en desarrollo a partir del 2020 y de manera anual. Bueno, estamos en 2021 y esa meta no se cumplió. Y lo que sucedió es que llegaron los países desarrollados con un plan de entrega que dice que esta meta no se va a cumplir sino hasta 2023. Es decir, pese a que tuvieron 12 años de planeación de esta estrategia, no se va a cumplir. Esto, por supuesto, que marcó un eje importante, un hito importante en la conferencia de las partes, el número 26, porque hubo mucha decepción por parte de los países en desarrollo de tener, digamos, que no se haya cumplido este objetivo de manera cabal como se había venido discutiendo. Y si bien hoy sabemos que los $100,000 millones no son suficientes para atender la emergencia climática, es un compromiso político que genera o que debe cumplirse para generar confianza en el proceso de cambio climático de la convención. Y ese es un tema muy importante, cómo generar confianza en un proceso que no está logrando llegar a los acuerdos necesarios. ¿Cómo esto impacta? Por supuesto, impacta en que no todos los países han sido principales receptores de financiamiento. Existe una distribución del financiamiento, sí, hay financiamiento que se va a regiones como Asia y Pacífico, a África, en América Latina, pero dentro de las regiones no todos los países reciben el financiamiento de la misma manera. Por ejemplo, en América Latina, aunque tenemos más de 40 países en América Latina, el financiamiento se sigue asignando a solo 5 países. Digamos, el financiamiento asociado a cambio climático se ha seguido, digamos, se ha seguido asignando a un número más o menos de 5 países, aunque hay otros que reciben el gran, digamos, el grueso de las inversiones se sigue invirtiendo, por ejemplo, en el caso de América Latina, en Brasil y México, que además, claro, son grandes emisores, también con economías emergentes, pero no, el financiamiento no está ahí en donde los países más vulnerables realmente lo requieren. En este sentido, hay un tema muy importante que también se discutió en esta COP, que tiene que ver con el famoso balance del financiamiento entre la mitigación y la adaptación. Por muchos años hemos hablado de la necesidad imperante de reducir emisiones causantes del cambio climático, lo cual se mantiene como una de las grandes demandas para lograr esa estabilización de las emisiones y evitar un aumento de más de 1.5 grados centígrados. Pero hoy, ya lo sabemos, el impacto del cambio climático es cada vez mayor y ya no podemos esperarnos a que logremos esa reducción de emisiones. Ahora toca acelerar la adaptación. Sin embargo, 90% del financiamiento se sigue yendo a la mitigación, mientras que solo el 10% se va a acciones de adaptación. En esta COP, ese tema del balance era un tema muy importante y afortunadamente una de las grandes líneas fue realmente aperturar toda una conversación en la negociación para hablar del tema del financiamiento para la adaptación, reconocer que existe un gap, una brecha importante en la financiación para la adaptación y se habla por primera vez de generar, por un lado, duplicar el financiamiento para la adaptación hacia el 2025, que es un acuerdo que se generó en el Pacto de Glasgow. Es importante decirles que aunque se duplique el financiamiento para adaptación en 2025, con base en el 2019, que fue el acuerdo, va a seguir siendo insuficiente. Tenemos que generar esquemas que den predictibilidad al financiamiento para la adaptación. Afortunadamente, en esta COP, varios países proveyeron de recursos al Fondo de Adaptación, que es un mecanismo que se generó desde el Protocolo de Kioto, pero que muchos países desarrollados no querían apoyar. Y justamente ahora hay algunos países que pusieron compromisos de financiamiento, como el caso de Estados Unidos, que nunca había puesto financiamiento para este fondo, pero ahora el tema general y muy importante es el acceso. El acceso a financiamiento fue otro tema muy importante que se trabajó en esta COP. Se reconoce por primera vez que los mecanismos multilaterales como el Fondo Verde del Clima, el Fondo para la Adaptación, el GEF, y también se habla de que los bancos multilaterales de desarrollo y otras instituciones financieras tienen que mejorar el acceso, particularmente para las poblaciones y los países vulnerables. Esto es muy importante porque lo que hemos observado a lo largo de todos estos años es que el financiamiento se va en donde existe esa capacidad institucional y lamentablemente en muchos países menos desarrollados, más vulnerables, no se cuenta siempre con la posibilidad de acceder a este financiamiento de manera más rápida y esto genera pues otra vez una gran brecha y una gran injusticia climática porque el financiamiento no se está yendo a donde realmente se necesita. Por eso, uno de los temas que también es muy importante considerar que esta COP también trató es el tema de las pérdidas y los daños. Ustedes saben que el tema de adaptación es muy importante porque es un proceso que nos va a permitir hacer frente a esos impactos negativos que trae consigo el cambio climático. Pero muchos países ya sufrieron los embates del cambio climático, es decir, ya hubo pérdidas económicas, ya hubo pérdidas sociales, y la pregunta es, ¿quién paga por ello? Por eso en esta COP los países vulnerables demandaron la creación de una facilidad para el tema de pérdidas y daños que lamentablemente los países desarrollados no quisieron aprobar y ahora se va a detonar un diálogo para lograr atender el tema de pérdidas y daños. Y esto es muy importante porque las pérdidas y daños están asociadas a poblaciones vulnerables, poblaciones indígenas, poblaciones locales, mujeres, niños que viven en extremas condiciones y que ahora encima de las condiciones que han sido, a las que se han visto, digamos, por las condiciones de pobreza y otras condiciones, ahora en el contexto de cambio climático tienen aún un mayor reto para poder hacer frente a estos temas. Finalmente, un tema que es muy importante y que yo creo que va a ser crucial y que ya hablaban hace un momento, Sebastián, del tema de participación. El tema de la transformación del sistema financiero en su conjunto implica la integración del cambio climático, ya no solo como un tema ambiental o como solo un tema, digamos, ajeno al resto de los sectores, hoy más que nunca tenemos que asegurar que todas nuestras estructuras de finanzas públicas estén integradas, estén, planeadas en función del cambio climático. Por eso no es solo importante revisar cómo están los flujos de financiamiento a nivel internacional, sino también observar con muchísima claridad y con mucha precisión qué están haciendo nuestros países con el recurso público a través de los presupuestos públicos de nuestros países. Cómo logramos generar una brecha en la que haya mayor transparencia, mayor participación de las poblaciones indígenas, de las poblaciones locales, de mujeres, de niños, de jóvenes, en la definición de los presupuestos, en la definición de hacia dónde se va el dinero para lograr realmente generar una nueva meta de financiamiento, que este es el tema que también se trató en la COP. Se estableció un plan, un programa de trabajo para establecer la nueva meta cuantificable de financiamiento que va a tener que considerar las necesidades de los países en desarrollo. Y aquí es un llamado importante. Cuando hablamos de las necesidades de países en desarrollo, no solo tenemos que pensar en las necesidades de los gobiernos, tenemos que pensar en las necesidades de la sociedad civil, de la población, de los ecosistemas. ¿Cómo vamos a poder cuantificar cuánto necesitamos para combatir el cambio climático si no hacemos esos procesos para entender cuánto nos cuesta el problema y cómo vamos a poder, conectar la movilización de financiamiento con esas necesidades que tenemos y realmente asegurar que haya acceso, que sea efectivo, que sea transparente, que sea participativo y que sea transformacional? El financiamiento ya no puede seguir abriendo más las brechas de desigualdad que hoy tenemos y por eso el financiamiento tiene que venir de y hacia la justicia climática para lograr que ya no tengamos más brechas, sino que logremos enfrentar el problema de manera estructural. Así que nos toca a todas y todos ser muy observadores, pero muy partícipes de esa transformación de los sistemas financieros, tanto a nivel nacional como internacional. Así que por aquí lo dejo para pasar a la conversación. Muchísimas gracias, Adriana.
Muchísimas gracias, Sandra, por darnos un mapa tan clave y claro de acción, con muchísimos puntos importantes. Como siempre lo logramos tener que planeamos mucho tiempo para la charla y que nos quedamos con poco. Sé que hay dos preguntas, una de Alex y otra de Annelise. Annelise está entrando nuevamente. Alex, ¿quieres comenzar con tu pregunta que es a Sandra? Y tendremos tiempo para una preguntita más si alguien tiene otra pregunta antes de cerrar. Tenemos que cerrar en 10 minutos, 11 minutos. Alex, do you want to? Or otherwise I can read your question.
Oh, I can unmute myself now. Great,
okay,
thanks.
Good.
No, just to Sandra, and it's great to hear your focus on the localization of climate finance and also around the need to distribute more equitably. But in my sense, in following some of those discussions, and I'm not following so closely as you are, but is that we still have a way to go to make the argument on why this needs to prioritize habitat rights vis-a-vis other demands that might be on the table. So I was wondering, from your perspective, how do you see habitat rights in the pool of different possibilities within which the localization of climate finance will be now really where the discussions is going to be around how to use this climate finance and why should we be investing on habitat rights? What is the argument around that you think is important to advocate in this context?
Por supuesto que sí. Yo creo que hay dos elementos muy importantes. Desde el punto de vista de la priorización, creo que definitivamente tenemos que hablar de estos derechos al hábitat y creo que justamente una de las discusiones es cuáles son o en dónde están esas necesidades para lograr que este financiamiento cuando llega se asigne de manera efectiva. Yo creo que el problema fundamental es que a los países les ha costado mucho trabajo identificar este derecho al hábitat como una de las grandes prioridades en donde se puede distribuir o en donde se puede, digamos, movilizar el financiamiento. Creo que justamente una de las grandes áreas es cómo logramos que los países empiecen a priorizar estos temas, empiecen a planear alrededor de estos temas y con ello hagan planes. Por ejemplo, algo que yo creo que hace falta a todos los países es lograr generar estrategias nacionales de financiamiento climático. Ustedes conocen que en el marco del cambio climático tenemos lo que se llaman las contribuciones nacionalmente determinadas, las National Determined Contributions, Y lamentablemente lo que muchos países ponen en esas contribuciones es muy limitado, cuando tendrían que ser planes progresivos en donde se integren todos estos temas y en donde podamos realmente priorizar. Yo creo que lo que falta es internalizar estos temas, conectarlos mejor y llevarlos, digamos, a la planeación y también a la movilización de recursos. Y solo un tema que me gustaría enfatizar aquí es financiamiento climático y sostenible. No es solo aquel, no tenemos solo que pensar en cómo canalizamos el financiamiento hacia las actividades en positivo, pero también tenemos que hablar de un fuerte proceso para decarbonizar el financiamiento. Muchas de nuestras economías siguen dependientes de los combustibles fósiles para generar ingresos. Entonces, ¿cómo lograr que el financiamiento realmente privilegie el derecho al hábitat, el derecho a un ambiente sano, si no estamos logrando la decarbonización de las finanzas públicas? Entonces, creo que aquí sociedad civil, academia, sector privado, tenemos que empujar hacia que esa se vuelva la prioridad del financiamiento y no esperar solo que los gobiernos lo decidan, porque no lo tienen claro.
Muchísimas gracias, Sandra. I'm going to shift again to Spanish. I know we have, I can see Edmundo's hand, and also I can see Ahmed comments, and we also had another question from Annelise. Annelise, ¿estás todavía en la audiencia? Era una pregunta para Sebastián.
Creo que Annelise se ha ido.
Se ha ido. Ok, entonces damos prioridad a we are going to give priority to those who are still with us, but if Annelise is around, please let me know. So Edmundo is raising an issue about livelihoods. Where do livelihoods fit in all this? And then Ahmed has also a point. Edmundo, first go for it. It's mostly a comment, I understand.
Thank you. Yes, I included it in the chat. I just wanted to bring in the issue of livelihoods, income, and employment. There is, of course, a lot of attention on community participation in regard to climate justice or lack of access to participation. This is definitely very important, has been very much addressed today. Let's also think that an important aspect of climate justice is the access to clean and decent jobs that broadly are called green jobs. So people also need to have access to livelihoods, to good sources of livelihoods in order to make a living, and in cities or even in rural areas. And this combines with the environmental issues and the climate justice. I think it's a very important element. And these green jobs are not necessarily equally distributed or are not necessarily decent jobs, and they need to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much for raising that point, Edmundo. Extraordinarily important, and it's true, we didn't unpack that enough or discuss that enough. I have now, and now I'm going to be very strict with the time. Ahmed, I think Ahmed also has a comment from Hik Menarishon, and then there is a question from Dulari from Yuba for David Dortmund. Ahmed, do you want to share your comment?
For me, Ahmed?
Yes.
Okay. بالعربي سريعا أحب بس أوجه أهمية تسليط الضوء على دور السياسي والالتزام لمؤسسات الأمم المتحدة في المشاريع التي تمولها مع حكومات الدول النامية، سواء فيما يتعلق بالاستثمار الزراعي أو التطوير الحضري أو العمراني. ودايما بيتم إغفال المشاركة الشعبية أو المشاركة العامة، خاصة من المجتمعات الأكثر تأثرا بقضايا التغير المناخي وتبعات التغير المناخي. ودائما ما يتم إغفال دور منظمات المجتمع المدني الممثلة في تلك المجتمعات المحلية، وبالتالي في دور أكبر على منظمات أو برامج الأمم المتحدة إن هي تعرف بشكل أكبر دورها كمؤسسات دولية ملتزمة بإعمال مبادئ حقوق الإنسان والقانون الدولي في ضرورة إشراك المجتمعات وخلق مناخ ديمقراطي، وأن تضمن المشاركة المجتمعية في تنفيذ تلك المشاريع مع الحكومات في الدول النامية. شكرا.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. We have two, so I have one question from Dulari for David. I can see Hala's hand, and also Sebastian has seen the question from Annalise and will be happy to close with that. So can I give the floor to Dulari and Hala very, very briefly, then to David Dortmund, and finally to Seb before we close. We need to close very, very shortly. Thank you.
Right. Yes. So first of all, thank you HIC and everyone, the organization, to organize this session. My question is to David. He spoke about building regulations pertaining to climate justice and how it is important to, you know, guide these policy guidelines. But in very contrast to that, the current situation in India, I'm from India, living in Mumbai. So there are so many deregulations happening on the environmental front, on the climate front. So as civil organizations, how do we kind of negotiate these deregulations with the government is my question. Our current work on climate justice, I'm actually mapping the climate hazards like flooding, air quality, land surface temperature. So what we are trying to do is find these urban poor communities in Mumbai who are vulnerable to climate. So this is the question which actually, you know, overlaps all these aspects of flooding and climate change. So thank you.
Thank you, Larry, for that point. Again, I'm going to get the stick for the timekeeping, poor timekeeping. Hala, if you have any question or comment, very, very briefly, and then I just want to give the floor to David and to Sebastian to close. Thank you.
شكرا أدريانا. فقط أردت أن أكمل ما بدأ به أحمد لأقول أن السياسات أيضا التي تفرزها بشكل أو بآخر الصناديق العالمية، صناديق التكيف مع تغير المناخ، صندوق التخفيف، وأيضا صندوق التمويل الأخضر. أردت فقط أن أتحدث أن هذه السياسات أيضا سياسات تفرز نوع من اللا عدالة في القضية المناخية، وذلك لأنها بالعادة نوع من
Sorry, Hala.
الحكومات تستطيع أن تحصل على التمويلات بذاتها. وبالتالي نوع من أنواع اللا عدالة يحدث عندما تعطى جميع التمويلات للمنظمات الكبيرة الأممية لتنفذ على الأراضي وفي البلدان الأكثر ضعفا، وبالتالي تذهب معظم التمويلات كنوع من المصاريف الإدارية والرواتب وغيرها، وهذا قد يحرم كثير من المجتمعات الفقيرة من حقهم، أيضا يؤدي إلى مزيد من اللا عدالة المناخية واللا عدالة البيئية كما يحدث في الأردن على سبيل المثال. وأنا أقوم اليوم بكتابة دراسة حول الموضوع. هنالك تمويلات ضخمة جدا تذهب إلى المؤسسات UN FAO وUN هابيتات UNDP وغيرها تنفذ المشاريع المرتبطة بالمناخ، وللأسف الشديد تنفذ ضمن خبرات أجنبية وليست ضمن خبرات محلية، مما حتى موضوع التحول المعرفي والانتقال المعرفي لا يكون بشكل عادل للمجتمعات الأكثر تضررا. فهذه أيضا نقاط علينا إثارتها على مستوى عالي ومستوى شعبي كبير.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you for that, and grateful if you can also share some of those details on the chat, please. Okay, we are now over the time, so unfortunately, I believe we don't have even time for a final, perhaps, I mean, just a final reflection, very brief final reflection, David Dortmund, not necessarily an answer to Durali. I don't know if you are still with us.
I can be very brief. I'd say firstly that any elements of negotiation are going to be pretty profoundly context specific, depending on the pre-existing relations between organized groups and governance institutions. But secondly, there's some really interesting work around what the principles might be around locally driven responses to climate change, including a set of locally led adaptation principles that have been quite widely adopted and that you can find readily online, which may be a basis for this. Some nice examples on flexible regulations from places like Cuba, where a single room is the core of the dwelling, which has to meet certain standards and other things can be built on around. From Uganda, where there have been precedent-setting examples with new building technologies, which first are demonstrated, and after they're demonstrated can then be used as a basis for negotiation around what might be allowed. But thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, David. We run out of time, but we will certainly continue this. And so before you leave, I'm only going to take 1 minute. And I just want to, on the one hand, say that HIC has a working group on climate justice, and you're all welcome to join it, but also to suggest different, proposals for the group to take forward. We are going to definitely continue this conversation. I can see we have many HIC members. So for all of you, just a reminder as well that we have our annual General Assembly on the 9th of December. Big thanks to all the speakers for the amazing contributions and taking us to every corner of what climate justice needs to look into and push for. Thanks as well for the interpreters for allowing us to have this conversation, and to HIC's General Secretariat staff for supporting this, the organization of this event in all forms and shapes. Before we all leave, I just want to invite you to switch on your cameras, and we're going to have a final picture until we see each other next. I can see Edmundo removing the glasses. That's a good idea. I don't have a single picture without glasses. Sophia, I give you the floor for any other instructions for the photo.
Thanks, Adriana. I think Irene must be taking care of that. Irene, you tell me. But just to thank everyone again. It was a great debate as always. Not enough time, but it's an excuse for us to try and reunite again. So we'll keep in touch and take care, everyone. Adriana, off to you.
Okay, thank you so much. A big hug and a big round of applause for all the interventions and all the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.